Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive. What a mouthful that is. So as always, I've pulled together a brief agenda. So we'll talk about all of my presentations tend to follow the same flow if you've attended other ones. So we'll talk about the strategic context, why the EU has introduced this directive, what it aims to achieve, what its implementation timeline is, because it's quite tight, really. We've got until the end of September to comply. How it is actually going to be implemented. And it's really been implemented by changes to two core pieces of existing EU regulation, which is the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and the Consumer Rights Directive, that are already long-standing pieces of EU legislation. And what this new directive does is it makes substantial changes to those two pieces of regulation. So if we're shipping consumer products into the EU at the moment, we should already be complying with those two pieces of regulation. And now this new Empowering Consumers regulation forces changes to those two pieces of existing regulation. So we'll cover off kind of like the core things that you need to know. So we'll talk about environmental claims, which is fundamentally what this is about. It's to close down unsubstantiated, inaccurate, false sustainability claims that manufacturers may be using to appeal to the sustainably conscious consumer, but in actual fact, they can't substantiate. And the rules around these kind of claims have been very woolly in the past. So this regulation seeks to clamp down on that. We'll talk particularly about the changes to the Consumer Rights Directive, because that brings durability and repairability into this regulation. Now, if you've attended my Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation, you'll be webinar, you'll be familiar with the durability and repairability criteria that companies are going to have to comply with in order to comply with ESPR. And what the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition does, that directive actually brings that durability and repairability focus into the Consumer Rights Directive. Oh my goodness, can you see how complicated this whole, honestly, it's mind-bending, this whole EU matrix structure of regulation, but hopefully I can break it down for you today. And then, as always, because the EU gets such a hard rap for its regulatory regime, then I always like to shine a light on other global regulation that will be similar in nature, never as robust, but similar in nature. So by complying with the EU's directive, then it stands you in good stead for complying with those other markets that have got their own regulations in place. Okay, so strategic context and rationale. Quite simply, consumers want sustainable products. We've got, and I say consumers because this is the focus of this directive, but we're seeing the increase in the sustainable business customer as well, the sustainable focused business customer as well. As I've mentioned, environmental claims can be vague, they're quite often unverifiable, and they can be somewhat misleading. And obviously the EU has 27 member states. This directive will apply to Northern Ireland and the EEA markets as well, and they've all got kind of like very fragmented rules around this kind of topic, and it undermines kind of like what the single market's trying to do. So the EU actually undertook an impact assessment, as it always does, before it introduces any new regulation. And the impact assessment is kind of like its formal evidence-based analysis that then accompanies the legislative proposal for changing those two core pieces of regulation that I talked about, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and the Consumer Rights Directive. If you're really sad and you want to read it, like I have to, then it's published as the Commission Staff Working Document, SWD 2022-85 Final, and it was published in March 2022. But the assessment essentially explains why the initiative is needed, what policy options were considered in terms of implementing the regulation, and how the preferred option, which is what they've settled upon here, will affect consumers, businesses that need to comply, and also the positive impact that it hopes to have on the environment as well. So when the EU did its impact assessment, it identified several core issues or problems, if you like. So the proliferation of misleading environmental claims. So over half of environmental claims assessed were deemed to be vague or misleading, and over 40% of them lacked evidence, so they couldn't be substantiated. There was deemed to be a lack of reliable, comparable sustainability information. So consumers can't make or can't easily distinguish between genuinely sustainable products and those that are marketed with weak or insufficient or kind of unverifiable claims. And then early obsolescence was something that was highlighted as being an issue. So consumers were deemed to be lacking clear information on a product's lifespan, hence the durability piece that's coming into regulation. So they didn't have sufficient information on product lifespan or on repairability or the availability of spare parts. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, that fragmented national approach meant that there was divergence between different member states, which obviously undermines the single market and what it's trying to do. So it also has this directive, that's basically the basis for why the regulation is being introduced. But then, as always, it's not one single piece of regulation. It impacts with other regulation already in place or in the process of being ratified, and obviously other initiatives, new and long-standing. So the ones that probably come to bear on this particular directive are the European Green Deal, Circular Economy Action Plan, the EU Eco-Label, which some of you may or may not be aware of, the new consumer agenda, and then the Sustainable Product Policy Framework, which includes ESPR and also the Green Claims Initiative, which hasn't come into force yet. It's been kind of like shelved, the Green Claims Directive. We were hoping to run a webinar on it, but we haven't had any further guidance from the EU because it's been shelved. So we've kind of parked that webinar for the time being. So just to reiterate, for some of you that aren't familiar with these pieces of regulation and initiative, the European Green Deal, you hear me talking about a lot. It's the EU's overriding strategy to transform Europe into this kind of modern, resource efficient, competitive economy that will be climate neutral by 2050. It's a big, hairy, audacious goal. It was launched in 2019, allegedly in response to citizens' demand for stronger climate action. And it basically sets out a really comprehensive plan to cut emissions, to redesign energy and transport systems, protect biodiversity, and shift to a circular economy. Now, on the subject of circular economy, so the Circular Economy Action Plan is the EU's strategy to shift from linear, which are kind of take, make, use, dispose, move from that linear model to an economy where products, materials and resources stay in circulation for as long as possible. Okay, so the fundamental objective is to reduce waste, minimize resource use, support a cleaner, more comprehensive Europe by promoting that product design that enables reuse, repair, and recyclability, those three things. And the Commission is very much saying that that transition is essential for reducing the pressure on natural virgin resources, essentially. Now, the Eco-Label I haven't talked to you guys about before, but it's the European Union's official voluntary label for environmental excellence. So it's only awarded to products and services that meet the EU's strict science-based criteria for reduced environmental impact across the entire lifespan of the product that's being assessed. obviously it's a recognized kind of kite mark, I suppose, a little bit like the CE mark, albeit that's mandatory and it's for product safety. This is voluntary and it's for sustainability criteria, but it helps consumers identify genuinely verified greener options when the market's kind of crowded with environmental claims. It's recognized across all of the EU member states, as well as obviously Northern Ireland and the EEA markets. And it sets kind of like EU-wide standards, if you like, that require independent verification to be able to make those kind of trustworthy, sustainable statements, if you like. Fundamentally preventing greenwashing, which is essentially what this new Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition and the Green Claims Directive, working hand in hand, are essentially aiming to do. Now, the new consumer agenda, I haven't talked to you about this before either, but that is the Commission's strategic framework for consumer policy. So it sets priorities for the coming years to ensure that consumers are fundamentally protected, empowered, and able to benefit fully from living in the territories within the single market. So it focuses on strengthening all consumer regulation, if you like, very heavily focused on supporting sustainable consumption now, and helping the EU achieve its green transition, if you like. Now, ESPR, I've spoken to you about before. That is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. It's one of two really heavyweight, heavy-hitting pieces of sustainability regulation that the EU has implemented and is fundamentally in its transition process between now and 2030. It focuses on products, whereas the other piece of regulation, the packaging and packaging waste regulation, focuses on the packaging of those products. Both have a bearing on extended producer responsibility, so the levies that you pay for the end of life of products and waste materials in the EU. But it links very closely with this particular regulation that we're talking about today. Now, as I mentioned, the two pieces of legal legal instruments for implementing the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition, my God, it's such a mouthful, are the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and the Consumer Rights Directive. So they're the two pieces of EU regulation that you will see fundamentally changed as a result of this directive that we're talking about today. So, and the UK has very similar legislation to this, but again, as with everything since Brexit, we are kind of like falling behind a lot of the initiatives that the EU is bringing in. So the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, it's the EU's core regulation or legislation that protects consumers from any kind of misleading or aggressive or kind of unfair business to consumer practices. That's fundamentally what it's there for. It has a harmonised framework that bans traders from giving untruthful information, hiding essential facts, or using any kind of pressure tactics to influence that consumer's decision. As with similar regulation in the EU, in the UK, sorry, it applies before, during, and after the transaction. So it's meant to boost consumer confidence in challenging businesses and making it easier for businesses to trade competitively and fairly across borders. Now, the Consumer Rights Directive, which we've got very similar in the UK here, that strengthens consumer protection by making sure that consumers have clear, essential, important information before making their purchasing decision, and make sure that they enjoy, pretty robust and consistent consumer rights across the whole of the EU. It applies to contracts between businesses and consumers, and it sets kind of like, when we talk about our 14-day cooling off period and our withdrawal rights and so on, that's all wrapped up in Consumer Rights Directive. Okay, so they're fundamentally the two legal instruments that will deliver the objectives of the empowering consumers for the green transition agenda or directive, sorry. Now, the regulatory objective, so what's it looking to do? So essentially, it's wanting to make sure that customers or consumers, sorry, can access reliable sustainability information so that they can make the right purchasing decisions that will in turn back up the EU's environmental goals. Okay, so strengthen protection against unfair commercial practices. What does that mean? Oh, sorry, I'm going ahead too fast there. Go back. The directive is basically aiming to curb practices that mislead consumers about a product's environmental claims. Okay, so it's basically tackling greenwashing, unreliable sustainability labels, claims that obscure product or product premature obsolescence, if you like. And the Commission's highlighting the needs to protect consumers from this kind of deceptive marketing that prevents them from making those sustainable choices. Now, a core objective of this directive is to improve the quality and reliability of sustainability information. So this is all about making sure that consumers have access to information on environmental impacts of the product, its durability and its repairability. And by improving the transparency of that information, the directive is seen to be able to support superior decision making, if you like, and an increased demand for genuinely sustainable products, not those that are purporting to be something that actually aren't. It promotes sustainable consumption patterns. So much of the regulation now from the EU is about helping it achieve that carbon neutral claim by 2050. So this directive is no different. It looks to help consumers shift their purchasing behaviours towards more sustainable goods. So by removing those kind of misleading claims and improving product information, it kind of aligns consumer choices with the EU's broader objectives of climate neutrality and those circular economy goals. Obviously, so much of EU regulation at the moment is about ensuring a level playing field, and very much looking to protect the businesses within the member states of the bloc, protecting them, giving them a level playing field. So this, a little bit similar to other regulation I've talked to you about in the past, is seen as being a way to not become protectionist. It's not about that, but it's about, okay, how can we stem the flow of products flooding the EU marketplace that are making inaccurate or false claims around sustainability when our own businesses are being held to a higher kind of like level. So by harmonizing the rules across the single market, this directive is going to make sure that businesses that are making genuine environmental efforts are not disadvantaged by competitors coming in from overseas or so on, or even local competitors within the EU that are using vague or unsubstantiated claims. So it's seen to be supporting fair competition and the integrity of what the EU is trying to achieve. So obviously with UK businesses, we have got to get through customs before we can even place our products on the UK market. So we're going to have to be really hot in terms of being able to make the correct claims and make sure that they are substantiated. And then obviously, as I've mentioned before, the whole purpose of a lot of this regulation is to support the EU's Green Deal and climate neutrality targets as well. So this is seen to be very much focusing the minds of consumers on truly sustainable products and reduce the consumption of those that aren't quite so sustainable. Now, the implementation timeline. So the implementation follows a kind of 4-stage date-specific implementation. So it came into force in 2024, and we've basically had between 2024 and the 27th of March this year as the transposition period, essentially. So as of the end of this month, we are in March, aren't we? Yes. Member states have had kind of like 2 years to transpose the directive into their national law. So the legal deadline, which all member states at the moment are looking like they're going to hit, which can't be said of the EU deforestation regulation and some other things that are around, they will have drafted this directive into their implementing legislation. They'll have their enforcement structures and penalties in line. They'll have distributed their national guidance and any kind of like templates that are needed, and they'll have made the relevant changes to those two legal instruments that we talked about. Now, by the end of September, this is where this regulation starts to bite. So businesses must comply by the 27th of September. This is really when enforcement begins. So the directive becomes fully applicable and enforceable across all 27 member states and the other markets I've mentioned from the 27th of September. And from that date, as businesses, we're going to have to make sure that we comply with new prohibitions on generic environmental claims, restrictions on offset-based neutrality claims, and I'll talk about that in a second, rules on sustainability labels, mandatory durability and repairability information that we're providing to consumers, any software-related obsolescence disclosures, and then making sure that we are compliant with the two strengthened legal instruments. Non-compliance will absolutely trigger penalties, perhaps injunctions. Sometimes things like this, it's reputational risk or reputational damage, which is almost, more damaging than penalties and so on. As with any piece of regulation, I've talked to you a lot about general product safety regulation when everybody was so kind of like, well, what are the penalties? We're not quite ready. There's always a kind of bedding in period where market surveillance authorities and customs will take a more relaxed approach. But usually after 12 months of the regulation being in force, we see that kind of like lenience exhausted, if you like. So the whole purpose of us doing these webinars is so that you can get ahead of the curve, and we've still got a good 6 months to get everything sorted. So let's just talk about the changes to the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive in particular. So there are a set of new blacklisted unfair commercial practices. So any kind of green or generic environmental claims without recognised verifiable evidence are going to be prohibited. So claims like eco-friendly, green, environmentally conscious are going to be banned unless the trader can demonstrate excellent environmental performance based on widely recognised, certification schemes or established EU rules. So that's the first one. Environmental claims based on carbon offsetting alone are no longer going to be permitted. So traders won't be able to claim that a product has a neutral, reduced or positive environmental impact solely because emissions were offset. That is no longer going to be permitted. Sustainability labels not based on certification or public authority schemes will be prohibited. So any label implying environmental or social performance must be backed by transparent, independently verified certification scheme or be established by a public authority. And claims about future environmental performance without measurable commitments will be prohibited as well. So that's where there are aspirational claims. We'll be carbon neutral by 2030. They're going to now have to be supported by clear, verifiable, time-bound plans and independent monitoring. And the EU sees that it's these kind of additions to the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive that will tackle the most common forms of greenwashing. Now, strengthened rules on misleading actions. So the directive directly amends Articles 6 and 7 of the UCPD to clarify that environmental and durability information cannot mislead consumers. So key changes would be Misleading environmental claims, so any claim that is vague, unsubstantiated, or presented without clear context can be considered misleading. Misleading claims about durability. So companies, we're going to have to ensure that we don't exaggerate a product's lifespan or suggest durability that the product cannot achieve under its normal use. And then misleading claims about repairability. So, businesses making claims about repair options, spare parts, or repair networks have to be accurate, and can't be overstated. Now, these provisions ensure that the sustainability related information is treated in the same seriousness as other things like price, quality, or safety information. Now, new rules addressing early obsolescence. So the directive introduces explicit prohibitions on practices that hide or misrepresent product obsolescence. So failing to inform consumers when a product has functionality limitations due to software. So if a device's performance will degrade following a software update, then that has to be disclosed to the consumer. Promoting replacement over repair when repair is feasible. So as businesses, we can't falsely claim that a product cannot be repaired or that a repair is impossible when actually that repair is feasible and is available. And then withholding information about spare parts or repair services. So omitting essential information that affects repairability would constitute a misleading omission, because that whole repairability is what the EU is trying to force through with this directive and others. So these changes are seen to be addressing what the EU found in terms of high frequency of early obsolescence when it did its impact assessment. Now, clarified rules on comparative environmental claims. So those comparative rules like greener than or more sustainable than, they all have to be substantiated now. So they have to be based on equivalent data sets, transparency about methodology used, comparable across the same product category. And that basically prevents traders from using selective or incomparable data to try and imply some kind of superior environmental performance. Interaction with sustainability labels and certification schemes. So the directive now introduces a new governance layer for sustainability labels. So labels have to be transparent, independently verified, and based on robust certification schemes. So the days of companies having their own certification schemes are long gone. So private labels must now meet strict governance criteria to avoid misleading consumers. And then public authority labels remain permitted, but must also meet transparency requirements. So this is basically in response to the EU noticing that there was a proliferation of sustainability labels that was causing confusion amongst consumers and worries by the Commission that many of them were unsubstantiated or had questionable methodologies. Strengthening enforcement expectations. So this isn't a direct textual change to the UCPD, but the directive is requiring member states to apply what it would class as proportionate and dissuasive penalties where it finds that a company is non-compliant. Ensure cross-border cooperation, that is cross-border within the EU itself, but also applies to third countries outside. So as with any kind of regulation with the EU, they liaise directly with their bodies here with their counterparts here in the UK if there's seen to be any kind of non-compliance. And this is, again, it's all looking to back the EU's broader sustainability agenda. So I suppose we could ask, why do these changes matter? So why this legal instrument, and why has the EU deemed this is the right time to do this? So essentially it was that impact assessment, that showed quite clearly that over 50% of environmental claims were vague or misleading and 40% lacked any supporting evidence. And it was just continues to cause a lot of confusion amongst consumers that can't differentiate or distinguish between truly sustainable products, genuine sustainable products, and those that aren't so. And obviously, it's also forcing businesses, if they want to make those claims, then they have to make real environmental investments to be able to do that. Okay, so that's essentially the changes to the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. The generic environmental claims, I touched on them a little bit earlier. So these are kind of broad, vague statements that suggest a product or a company is environmentally beneficial without specifying kind of exactly what aspect is greener or providing that verifiable evidence. And you might be sat there listening at the moment and thinking, going through your kind of marketing and labeling strategy and so on, and thinking, you know, do we do that? Which is an important question to ask and part of your compliance moving forward. So these claims are kind of, and I've listed some of them here, are exactly the type that the EU is seeking to kind of ban. So if we look at environmentally friendly, so that implies an overall positive impact on the environment without actually defining how, you know, what that impact is or how it's measured. Eco-friendly, we see an awful lot. So a common but unsubstantiated claim, unless it's backed by verifiable or recognised proof. Green, I mean, green. Too general to be meaningful without context or substantiation, so that, you know, these words will be basically outlawed unless they can be verified or substantiated. Environmentally conscious, so again, it's broad, it's non-specific, it suggests a product, service or company behaves in a way that's good for the environment, but it doesn't explain how or provide any kind of like measurable evidence. Climate neutral, that's when it's based solely on offsetting. So where we're sat at the moment in this office at the back, we've got something like 200 acres of afforestation, which is was paid for by a rather large airline, which I won't mention the name of, but essentially that is their offsetting. So they haven't changed their practices as a business, but they have offset their carbon footprint by planting 200 acres of 200 acres of field at the back of our farm here. So that will be banned also. So you have to be a lot more, you know, if you're climate neutral, you have to be truly climate neutral, not just because you're offsetting your carbon footprint. And then sustainable, that's such a broad claim that really requires or should require evidence of super high environmental impact or environmental performance across a product's entire lifespan from design through to end of life. So these examples are all, and we could go on, there are more, you know, scrutinize the products that you see on the shop floor and so on, and just see some of the claims that are being made. But this is fundamentally one of the reasons why the directive is being introduced. It's to kind of prohibit these claims unless they can be substantiated and verified. Sustainability labels. So as I've said, I haven't talked to you about the EU eco label before, but that's definitely one of the acceptable labels that the EU, probably because it is its own kind of like voluntary label at the moment. But they are labels that communicate quite clearly to consumers that a product's been assessed against a specific criteria related to environmental impact, resource use, social responsibility, and ethical production. So as I said before, a little bit like the CE mark denotes product safety, then the EU eco label promotes or denotes kind of like that environmental standard. What else did I want to say? Currently, there are 3 different types of sustainability labels. Okay, so you've got the public authority labels, which are created and governed by the EU or national authorities. So the EU eco label is a prime example of that, and they're considered the most trustworthy because they follow transparent, science-based criteria and independent verification. That last bit is really important. But then you've got certification-based private labels, and they're run by independent organisations with kind of clear governance and third-party verification, published criteria, and so on. I would see like the B Corp accreditation as being a good example of that. But then you've got proprietary or self-declared labels, and they're the ones that are created by companies themselves without any independent oversight. They're the most problematic, and they're the ones that this directive is aiming to target. Why the EU regulates sustainability labels? Well, fundamentally because it had found that the market was overcrowded with a plethora of private labels, many with very weak or opaque criteria. And this was confusing consumers, like I said. So the directive now moving forward is going to insist that any sustainability label must be based on a certification scheme, established by a public authority, and transparent, independently verified and governed by clear rules. So labels that don't meet those criteria will be considered to be misleading under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and they'll be kind of outlawed or not permitted to be used anymore. What does this mean in practice? Well, if you need to really take a look at your product range and understand if you are using a sustainability label, that it's backed by credible, independently verified schemes, because consumers fundamentally must be able to understand that what the label means, what the criteria were that were used, who verified the compliance, and whether the scheme is recognised or public. And the whole idea is that it shifts this kind of trust in sustainability information and makes sure that labels genuinely reflect better environmental or sustainability practice. So I've given here a list of what will be acceptable once this regulation is in place, and what will be deemed as not acceptable in terms of sustainability labels. Environmental protection, can't speak, future environmental performance claims. So talked before about how these can't be vague anymore. So the directive has set very strict conditions for future environmental claims, because the Commission found that many companies were making aspirational promises without any real kind of like meat on the bones, if you like. So future improvements or performance claims must be clear, specific, and have measurable commitments. So the claim must be tied to concrete, time-bound, and quantifiable environmental objectives. So you can't make vague aspirations, aiming to be greener. They'll be no longer acceptable. There must be a realistic and evidence-based implementation plan. So the business must have a detailed plan showing how the target will be achieved. So that's defined actions, timelines, resource allocation, and so on. There must be independent monitoring and verification. So any progress towards a future claim has to be subject to independent third-party monitoring. So self-assessment or internal reporting will no longer be sufficient. And again, as I mentioned earlier, no reliance on offsetting alone. So a company won't be able to claim future climate neutrality or similar kind of, claims solely through carbon offsets. So the real emission reductions must form the core of the commitment. So it's going to be a lot more, it's going to mandate a lot more transparency. And then transparency about assumptions and methodology. So the basis for the claims, the data sources, the calculations, the methods, and the boundaries, all must be accessible and understandable to consumers. So this is where the empowerment piece comes in. So you're empowering consumers to basically hold you to account for the statements that you're making about your product, your service, or your company. Now, the second legal instrument that's impacted by this empowering consumers for the Green Transition Directive is the Consumer Rights Directive, which is a pretty important piece of legislation. So it's essentially saying that the new Empowering Consumers Directive is ensuring that customers receive clear, reliable details about durability, repairability, and guarantees, which all pushes them towards making more sustainable purchasing decisions. Durability information. So this is a big part of the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation. That I think a recording of our previous webinar is on our YouTube channel for that. But essentially that says that consumers purchasing a product must be told before their purchase that the producer offers a commercial guarantee of durability and what that exact duration is. And when no durability exists, this absence has to be made explicit. So if you're not offering a durability guarantee, then you need to state that quite clearly. And then you need to disclose the expected product lifespan subject to normal use, if you like, where you have that information available. And that basically allows consumers to make those decisions based on longevity, true longevity, rather than marketing claims. Now, repairability is another big focus of the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation, and it is as part of the empowering consumers as well. So as a business, you must provide, moving forward, clear, accessible information on the availability of spare parts, how long they'll be available, repair instructions, and repair services or authorised repair networks where relevant. Now, moving forward, as part of the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation, there's going to be a repairability score. We don't have that at the minute, subject to a delegated act that hasn't come through yet. But once we have that repairability scoring, each product will carry that as part of its digital product passport, which again is another criteria that allows consumers to make an informed choice over your product over another one. There's also software related performance and updates. So as I said earlier, where digital elements affect product performance, then you need to make that clear so that consumers have that information before making the purchase. So, if software updates are necessary, how long are you going to provide those updates for? How long is that product going to be in support, if you like, and whether those updates impact functionality or whether they contribute to product degradation, if you like, performance degradation over time. And this kind of addresses the EU's concerns about obsolescence and so on. So this is how it's targeting that. Transparency on sustainability labels. I think I'm labouring this one now, but although detailed rules sit in the UCPD that I've just talked about, the amendments to that legal instrument, the Consumer Rights Directive also has details on there that basically specify any sustainability label used must be based on a certification scheme or public authority scheme, and that environmental information that's provided for the product, the service of the company is clear, relevant, and not misleading. So supporting those informed choices again. Okay, so that's basically the changes to the Consumer Rights Directive. I just want to cover off durability because it kind of dovetails with ESPR as well. So the Empowering Consumers Directive introduces this new legally binding set of durability information. Now, you could argue that this is going to be enforced before the Eco Design for Sustainable Products is going to be enforced. And again, it's all about shifting consumer purchasing decisions to more sustainable choices and so on. But that durability becomes a required part of the information that you must provide before a consumer commits to that purchase, whether that be online or whether it be through a bricks and mortar physical retail outlet. So, it's whether you as the business offers a commercial guarantee of durability, the duration of that guarantee, clear disclosure when no durability guarantee exists so consumers can compare lifespans of different products, any available information on expected product lifespan where you as the business have that data. Those commercial guarantees of durability. So the directive very much strengthens the legal framework around commercial durability guarantees. So where you as a business voluntarily offer a durability guarantee, you must ensure that that guarantee is binding, transparent and consistent with EU consumer law. The guarantee absolutely must specify what is covered, for how long, and under what conditions, if you like. So being very specific about certain parts of a product and under what conditions, usual wear and tear or normal use, etc. And then traders, businesses must communicate that this guarantee is clearly at the point of sale. When we talk about durability in relation to early obsolescence, so that is you know, talking about when the EU has these concerns about early obsolescence. So businesses aren't going to be able to mislead consumers about a product's expected lifespan. They're not going to be able to omit any kind of information about factors that significantly limit durability. So like I said before, that's software-related performance degradation. And importantly, they're not going to be able to suggest that a product is more durable or has a greater lifespan than it actually does have under normal use conditions. So that's when, I suppose, test data comes to the fore and so on. How does durability link to the wider EU sustainability agenda? Well, quite simply, it's part of the broader EU strategy to shift consumption patterns. Huge part of the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation, huge part of the Circular Economy Action Plan. And then what does that mean for you guys sat here today? So essentially, the practical implications of this are you're going to have to collect and verify your durability information where you have it, update product pages, update labels, update pre-contract disclosures, make sure that your marketing claims about lifespan are accurate and substantiated. Make sure that sales and customer service personnel are able to communicate accurately durability guarantees, make sure that they're correct, and then align those durability claims to other sustainability related disclosures like around repairability and so on. I'm getting told to wrap up. I am almost there. Moving on to repairability, I'm just going to run through some of these very, very quickly. So this is the other criteria. So availability of spare parts. Consumers must be told whether spare parts are available, which parts are available, how long they'll remain available. This is at the point of purchase. This kind of avoids the situation whereby a consumer buys something and then finds out that spare parts are no longer available shortly after buying and that there's no repairability. Availability of repair instructions. So you must disclose whether such instructions exist, how consumers can access them. Moving forward with digital product passports, we'll be able to include those kind of repairability instructions in with digital product passport, and then also whether repairs are undertaken by independent repairers, and in which case who are they, where are they, how can they be contacted. Availability of repair services, kind of like the same things, so disclosing authorized repair networks, independent repair options, and also disclosing any restrictions that limit who can perform those repairs. Repairability scoring, we don't have it at the moment, but it is on its way via a delegated act under the Eco Design regulation. Once we have that will appear in the digital product passport alongside durability. There'll be a repairability score as well, so we'll keep you posted on that. Repairability and early obsolescence. So this is all, making sure that you're not declaring a product as repairable when it's not. You're not omitting information about limitations that impact that repairability, and that you're promoting replacement where a repair is feasible. How repairability fits in with the EU, hopefully this is quite clear now after what I've gone through, but obviously it sits alongside the Eco Design for Sustainability regulation. It sits alongside the Right to Repair Directive. If you want to know more about the Right to Repair Directive, I believe our webinar on that is on our YouTube channel also. And it also sits along national repair initiatives that member states have implemented pending this regulation coming into force. And then what are your practical implications from where you sit today? So you're going to have to gather your repairability information from that you have in-house or sits with your suppliers. You're going to have to update product listings, packaging and pre-contract disclosures. Make sure that those repairability claims are substantiated. Make sure that your staff are communicating, whether that be sales staff or customer service staff, are communicating repair options accurately, and then prepare for that repairability scoring. And the minute that we have that delegated act on repairability and the other one on durability, we'll absolutely share that with you. Obviously, the repairability side of things we're seeing in conversations that we're having with our clients is it's going to impact businesses across electronics, appliances, furniture, textiles, and other consumer goods sections. Global perspective, never want to do the EU down on its regulations. I've just listed other, never as robust as the EU. I think that the biggest difference is other jurisdictions, so I've provided the UK, US, Australia, and so on, they focus mainly on greenwashing, while the EU does the greenwashing bit, but also integrates durability and repairability into that consumer law as well, which none of the others do. Down at the bottom, I've given some international standards for environmental claims and labels. They're not, they're kind of voluntary at the moment, but they are really good frameworks, and the EU's directive aligns strongly with those standards, especially in its treatment of sustainability labels. So they are really, really good ones to take a look at and follow with your sustainability claims. How to prepare to ensure compliance. So just to run through these, and you can read through them at your leisure. So overhaul all of your environmental claims and marketing practices. You know, you're going to have to look at everything from marketing to web content to copy to labeling, all of that, to make sure that your claims are substantiated and verifiable. If you are using any sustainability labels, again, are they going to be acceptable sustainability labels for the EU? Make sure that the durability and repairability information, you can meet those requirements pending the durability and repairability scores. Make sure that you're addressing that early obsolescence risk that I've talked about. I can't stress enough the importance of internal governance and data and processes at the moment. So much of EU regulation is about having that data, having a formal process in place, being able to substantiate everything that you're doing and provide proof that you're doing things compliantly. So take a look at your internal governance, your data systems, and what process you go through to substantiate these kind of claims. Obviously, when you've done all of this work, you're talking about updating all of your consumer facing materials and sales processes. Prepare for that national transposition and enforcement. So be aware that because the two legal instruments that are being changed, they are directives, it does mean that potentially different EU member states can make them a little bit more stringent. They can't withdraw the kind of, they can't make them less stringent, but they can add bits to it. So we might see that, you know, France and Germany are often at the forefront of making regulation more stringent. We are possibly going to see that there will be different interpretations of these two legal instruments across the 27 member states. But again, you know, we'll monitor the impact of that, and maybe we do an update webinar in the future to see, you know, whether that is actually happening or not. And then, you know, integrate your compliance into your broader sustainability and ESG strategy. While the EU is forging ahead and the UK is falling behind, there's no evidence at the moment that we are deviating substantially. We're falling behind because we're not, you know, keeping up the pace. But as with CBAM, as with EPR, we are kind of like following the EU's direction. So I'd say any kind of work that you're doing here just obviously makes you compliant for the EU market, but importantly, reduces the work that you have to do when the UK kind of like catches up. And then I've talked about building a transition roadmap. That's just something that helps with internal scheduling and so on. You know, what do you need to do by when? The last two slides are just the available support that we've got. We've got a bevy of support now, in addition to our free Global Trade Clinic sessions. We've got support packages, GTD Fast Track and GTD Bite Sizes coming online in the next couple of weeks. And obviously we're gearing up massively at this end of the GTD platform for being able to offer our clients digital product passports and also EU deforestation regulation compliance. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And then just some blurb on keeping in touch and joining our community. and I think that's it. I mean, I really have rushed through that. I did promise it wasn't going to be a particularly heavy webinar, but